The war had been over for 3 days. But the planet did not know that yet. The sky above the draconian outpost was still dark with smoke. The ground was cracked and burned black in long ugly strips where the energy weapons had hit. Broken walls leaned against each other like tired old men. Pieces of metal and stone were scattered everywhere, sharp and cold in the pale morning light. There was no sound except the wind, and the wind had nothing good to say. Deep inside a collapsed shelter near the edge of the outpost, something moved. It was small. It was slow. And it was trying very hard not to make noise. Vorin pressed himself lower against the cold ground and pulled his wings tighter around the small body beside him. His brother Sail had not moved on his own in almost 2 days now. His pale silver scales, which had always caught the light in a way that made Vorin think of still water, were dull and dry. His breathing was shallow. Each breath came out thin and uneven, like a candle flame in a drafty room, always just one breath away from going out. Vorin counted every single one. He had been counting since the first night. It had started during the evacuation. The clan had moved fast, the way they always moved in a conflict. Together, loud, urgent, with the stronger ones at the front and the weaker ones pulled along in the middle. Vorin and Sail had been near the back. They were young, not yet old enough to carry weapons or hold a position in the formation. They were supposed to stay close to the elder females who managed the rear group. But the rear group had been hit. A blast had taken out the path behind them, and in the smoke and the noise and the screaming, everyone had scattered. Vorin had grabbed Sail by the arm and pulled him behind a broken wall. A second blast had come down nearby, and a piece of the ceiling had fallen and caught Sail hard across the chest before Vorin could pull him clear. Sail had gone limp almost immediately. Vorin had dragged him deeper into the shelter, into the dark, away from the fire and the noise. He had pressed his wings over his brother like a shield and waited for someone to come back for them. No one came back. The noise of the evacuation faded. The sound of the conflict moved away. Then silence came in and filled up all the empty space the way cold water fills a hole in the ground, completely and without mercy. Vorin had roared into that silence until his throat felt like dry sand. He had called out in every direction until the sound of his own voice started to frighten him. He had moved to the entrance of the shelter 3 times, looked out at the ruined street, and seen nothing alive in any direction. Then he had gone back to Sail and sat down and wrapped his wings around him again. That was where he had stayed. The first day had been the hardest. Vorin had kept expecting to hear footsteps. He had kept expecting the sound of a draconian scout unit coming back to do a sweep, the way Doctrine said they were supposed to after an evacuation. He had kept believing that someone in the clan had noticed, had counted heads, had realized 2 of the younger ones were missing and turned around. He believed that for most of the first day. By the second day he had stopped believing it. Draconian military culture was not built around going back. It was built around going forward. You moved, you survived, you protected the group. Individual losses in a conflict zone were unfortunate, but they were not a reason to stop. They were not a reason to risk the rest. The Doctrine was clear on this, had always been clear, and every dragon in every clan learned it young enough that it became less like a rule and more like a fact of the world, like gravity, like the cold. Vorin had learned it too. He had just never expected to be on this side of it. He looked down at his brother's face. Sail was 2 years younger than him, smaller in build, lighter in color. He had always been the quieter of the two, the one who asked questions instead of making statements, the one who wanted to understand how things worked rather than just whether they worked. He used to follow Vorin around the outpost and point at things, machinery, animals, strangers passing through, and ask what they were called and why they existed. Vorin had found it exhausting sometimes. He would give almost anything to hear it now. The wound on Sail's chest was bad. Vorin had looked at it carefully on the first night, in the thin light coming through a crack in the wall. The scale plates around the injury were cracked and pushed inward. The tissue underneath was dark and swollen. Vorin had no medical training. He had pressed his own palm over it because it seemed like the right thing to do and because he needed to do something with his hands. He did not know if it was helping. He did not know what else to try. What he knew was this: Sail's breaths were getting shorter. They had been getting shorter for a full day now. Not quickly. Not all at once. Just slowly, gradually, the way light fades at the end of the day, so slowly you almost do not notice until you look up and realize the dark has already come. Vorin noticed. He noticed everything. He had nothing else to do but notice. He noticed the way the dust moved near the entrance when the wind came in. He noticed the sounds the broken structure made when the temperature dropped, the small cracks and settlings of stone and metal cooling in the night. He noticed that there was a thin line of pale light coming through the eastern wall that moved across the floor through the day, and that he had now watched it complete its slow journey from one side to the other twice. 2 full days. No one had come. On the morning of the third day, Vorin stopped expecting rescue and started doing something else instead. He was not sure what to call it. It was not hope exactly. It was smaller than hope and quieter. It was more like a decision. A decision to stay. A decision that if the world had decided to leave Sail behind, then Vorin had decided to disagree with the world, and he was going to keep disagreeing for as long as Sail kept breathing. He adjusted his wings. He made sure the warmth was even on both sides of his brother's body. He lowered his head until his chin rested lightly on top of Sail's and stayed very still. Outside, the wind moved through the ruins. It passed over broken walls and burned ground and scattered wreckage. It moved through empty streets where nothing lived. It carried ash and cold and the smell of a conflict that was already being forgotten by everyone who had been a part of it. It passed over the shelter where 2 young dragon brothers lay alone in the dark. And then, far out at the edge of the ruined outpost, something else moved. Something small. Something on 2 legs. Something that walked slowly and carefully through the wreckage, stopping every few steps to check a small device in its hand. It wore a dull gray jacket and carried a pack on its back. It had no weapons visible. It moved without aggression, without speed, without the sharp, deliberate purpose of a soldier. It stopped near the entrance to the collapsed shelter. It looked at its device. It looked at the entrance. It looked at the device again. Then it did something that no draconian doctrine, no military logic, no survival calculation would have recommended. It put the device away. It stepped over the broken threshold and walked inside. Vorin heard the footsteps before he saw anything. He was on his feet instantly, wings spread, teeth showing, every muscle pulled tight. Whatever was coming through that door was going to find out very quickly that this shelter was not empty and that the thing inside it was not going to move. The footsteps stopped. And in the thin pale light coming through the cracked eastern wall, Vorin saw what had come. It was small. It was soft-skinned. It had no claws, no scales, no natural armor of any kind. By every draconian measure of strength and threat, it was nothing. It looked at him for a moment. Then it looked at Sail. Then it did something Vorin had not expected at all. It sat down on the floor. Slowly. Carefully. Like it had all the time in the world. And it started to talk. Ned Hale had seen a lot of bad places in his 3 years with the Reach Corps. He had worked in flood zones and collapsed mining sites and the cold aftermath of 3 different conflicts on 4 different planets. He had walked through places that smelled like smoke and places that smelled like death and places that smelled like both at the same time. He had learned early that the universe had a very large number of ways to make a place feel completely empty of hope, and that most of those ways looked more or less the same when you were standing in the middle of them. This place looked like all of them at once. The ruined draconian outpost stretched out in every direction around him, flat and broken and gray in the early morning light. His boots crunched over small pieces of stone and metal with every step. The air tasted like ash. The sky above was the color of an old bruise, pale purple and yellow at the edges where the sun was trying to come through the smoke and not quite managing it. Ned walked slowly the way he always walked in ruins. Fast movement in unstable structures was how you ended up under them. He kept his eyes moving, checked the ground before each step, and listened to the quiet. His scanner drone floated 2 meters to his left, running a standard sweep pattern. It was a small unit, gray and round, about the size of a human head. It mapped heat signatures, flagged structural instability, and logged anything that moved. It was good at its job and it had no feelings about any of it, which Ned sometimes envied. He was supposed to be doing a routine hazard sweep of the outer grid. Log the unstable structures, mark them on the map, head back to base before the temperature dropped in the afternoon. Simple work. Quiet work. The kind of work that felt almost peaceful if you did not think too hard about why the ruins were ruins in the first place. The drone pinged. Ned stopped walking and looked at the small screen on his wrist unit. The drone had flagged a heat signature 60 meters ahead, inside a collapsed shelter near the eastern edge of the outpost. 2 sources. Close together. Faint but present. He zoomed in on the reading. The sources were warm. Not object warm, not residual heat from a fire warm, but living creature warm. The kind of warmth that came from a body working hard to stay alive. The drone's automated assessment appeared below the reading in small clean letters. Unknown priority. Likely animal. Structural risk high. Recommend bypass. Ned read it twice. He looked at the shelter ahead. He looked back at the reading. The 2 heat sources were very close together. One was a little larger. One was noticeably weaker. He stood there for a moment in the cold ash-tasting air and thought about the word bypass. Then he reached over and switched the drone to standby mode. "Stay here," he said to it, which was a habit he had never quite managed to break even though the drone did not understand words and did not care either way. He unclipped his medkit from his belt, checked that it was sealed and ready and walked toward the shelter. The entrance was low and partially blocked by a fallen beam. Ned ducked under it carefully, tested the ground just inside with 1 foot before putting his weight on it and moved into the dark. It took his eyes a few seconds to adjust. The shelter was dim, lit only by thin lines of pale light coming through cracks in the walls and ceiling. The air inside was stale and cold and smelled strongly of draconian, a heavy mineral smell like hot stone. Ned had smelled it before in field work. He recognized it immediately. He also recognized the sound he heard a half-second later. A low, sustained hiss. The kind that did not come from pipes or settling structures. The kind that came from a throat. Ned went completely still. He saw them then. At the far end of the shelter, about 8 meters away in the deepest part of the dark. A young dragon on its feet, wings spread wide, body low, teeth showing in the thin light. Its eyes caught what little light there was and held it, 2 pale points of intensity aimed directly at Ned with an expression that was absolutely clear in any language. "Come any closer and see what happens." Behind it, barely visible beneath the spread wings, was a second dragon. Smaller. Lying still on the ground. Not moving. Ned did not move either. He stood exactly where he was and did a fast, quiet assessment the way his training had taught him. Young dragon, adolescent probably, no visible weapons beyond the natural ones which were considerable. Defensive posture, not aggressive, it was not advancing, it was covering. It was protecting something behind it. The stillness of the one on the ground was not sleep stillness. It was the particular kind of stillness that meant the body was spending every bit of energy it had on something more important than moving. Ned had seen that stillness before. He did not like seeing it now. He needed to get closer. He needed to see the injury. He needed to open his kit and get to work. None of that was going to happen until the dragon in front of him made a decision about whether he was a threat. He could not explain himself in Draconian. He did not have a translation unit on him. It was a routine sweep he had not packed for a medical situation. He could not show credentials or explain the Reach core or describe what was in his medkit. He had no way to make himself understood through words. So he did not try words. He moved his hands out slowly from his sides, palms forward, fingers open. The universal gesture that even species with no shared history seem to understand on some level. "Nothing in my hands, nothing hidden, look for yourself." The hissing did not stop. But the dragon did not move forward. Ned took one slow breath. Then he did something that was either very smart or very stupid and he genuinely was not sure which. He sat down. Right there on the dusty broken floor of the shelter, 8 meters from a young dragon that could close that distance in about 1 second if it decided to. He folded his legs, placed both palms flat on the ground in front of him and looked up. Not at the dragon's eyes directly. Slightly to the side. Enough to show he was aware, not enough to make it feel like a challenge. And then he started talking. Not commands. Not instructions. Not the careful formal language he used when filing reports or speaking to officers. He talked the way he talked to people in the field when they were hurt and scared and needed something steady to hold on to, quiet, low, even. He talked about small things. He said he was not going to hurt anyone. He said he had a kid on his belt that could help. He said he had come in from the north side of the outpost and the weather out there was cold but not dangerous. He said he had a sister back home who was afraid of storms and how he used to sit outside with her during them when they were young so she would not feel alone. He had no idea if the dragon understood a single syllable. He kept talking anyway. Because he was not really talking to be understood. He was talking to give the dragon time. Time to watch him, time to read him, time to decide. The voice was not the message. The stillness was the message. The sitting down on the floor in front of you was the message. The not leaving was the message. A minute passed. Maybe 2. The hissing faded slowly like a kettle cooling down. The wings were still spread. The teeth were still showing. But the body had shifted, just slightly, just enough. The weight was no longer fully forward. The neck was not as low. Something in the posture had moved from "I will fight you" to "I am watching you very carefully and I have not decided yet." Ned kept his hands flat on the floor and kept his voice low and kept his eyes just slightly to the side and waited. He was very good at waiting. It was maybe the most important skill in field medicine and nobody ever talked about it that way, but it was true. You could know every technique, carry the best kit, understand the biology perfectly, and none of it meant anything if you could not wait for the moment when the fear stepped back just far enough to let you in. He waited. And then, slowly, with a heaviness that looked like the most difficult thing the young dragon had ever done, Vorin stepped to the side. Just one step. Just enough. Ned picked up his medkit, moved forward on his knees across the dusty floor and got to work. Ned had worked in bad light before. He had stitched wounds by the glow of a cracked helmet light. He had set broken bones in the back of a moving transport with nothing but feel and experience to guide him. He had done chest compressions on a species he had never treated before while reading a file on his wrist unit at the same time. He was not a doctor. He had never claimed to be. But he was good at staying calm when everything around him was telling him not to be, and right now that was the most important tool he had. He moved across the shelter floor on his knees and stopped beside Sail. Up close, the young dragon looked worse than he had from across the room. The pale silver scales around the chest wound were cracked and pushed inward at an angle that told Ned the impact had come from above and slightly to the left. The tissue underneath the broken plates was dark and swollen, almost black at the center, fading to a deep bruised purple at the edges. There was dried fluid along the lower edge of the wound, thick and dark, not quite the color of blood but close enough that Ned's brain filed it in the same category automatically. He put 2 fingers very lightly against the side of Sail's neck, just below the jaw where the scale texture changed and the skin beneath was thinner. He felt a pulse. Faint. Slow. But there. He let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Behind him, Vorin had not moved from his new position. He had stepped aside but he had not gone anywhere. He was standing 2 meters back, watching every single thing Ned did with the focused intensity of someone who had decided to trust something but had not yet decided to stop being afraid. His tail moved slowly across the floor behind him. His eyes did not blink. Ned opened his medkit. He worked through the kit inventory by touch, the way he always did in low light. Pressure packs on the left side, fluid lines and compounds in the middle, scanning tools and reference equipment on the right. His fingers found the small diagnostic wand and he ran it slowly over Sail's chest, keeping the movement gentle and even. The wand connected to his wrist unit and started pulling data. Ned looked at the small screen and read what it gave him. Internal pressure in the chest cavity was elevated. One of the secondary breathing structures. Draconians had a more complex respiratory system than humans, with 2 primary chambers and a smaller auxiliary one, was showing compromised function. The primary chambers were still working, which was the only reason Sail was still breathing at all. But the auxiliary chamber had fluid around it, and if that pressure kept building, the primaries would start to struggle too. Ned pulled up his alien anatomy file. He had downloaded it 14 months ago on a slow posting at a relay station with nothing much to do in the evenings. He had gone through files on 12 different species, reading the medical sections the way some people read long complicated books. Slowly, carefully, not because he expected to need it immediately but because he believed that knowing things was never wasted. The Draconian section had been one of the longer ones. He had read it twice. He was very glad about that now. He found the section on chest trauma and read through it quickly, checking his diagnosis against the file. The swelling around the auxiliary chamber matched what the file called a secondary compression injury. The treatment protocol recommended pressure relief on the exterior wound first, followed by a bioadaptive compound to reduce internal inflammation, followed by temperature stabilization because draconian bodies lost the ability to regulate their own core temperature efficiently when under this kind of physical stress. Ned could do all 3 of those things. He started with the wound. He cleaned the area around the broken scale plates carefully, using a sterile solution from a small bottle in the left side of the kit. Vorin made a sharp sound behind him when the solution touched the wound. Ned stopped, waited, spoke quietly without turning around. It's cleaning solution. It won't hurt him. It's okay. He did not know if Vorin understood the words. But he kept his voice level and his movements slow and after a moment the sharp sound stopped. He continued. He could not close the wound the way he would close a human wound. The scale structure was different, the tissue underneath was different, and he did not have the specialized tools that a proper draconian medical unit would carry. What he could do was stabilize it. He packed the wound carefully with a bioadaptive compound from the middle section of his kit, a gray-white substance that worked by reading the chemical environment of the tissue it touched and adjusting its behavior accordingly. It was expensive and he only had 2 doses left, but he used a full one on Sail without thinking twice about it. Then he dealt with the temperature issue. Sail's body was cold. Not cold the way a body got in sleep, but cold the way a body got when it was spending everything it had on staying alive and had nothing left over for anything else. Ned pulled off his jacket. It was a heavy gray field jacket, slightly too large for him, worn soft at the elbows. He folded it and laid it carefully over Sail's midsection, tucking the edges in on both sides. He heard Vorin make a sound behind him. A different sound this time. Quieter. Lower. Ned set up a slow fluid line next, threading it carefully into a vein access point at the base of Sale's neck that the anatomy file had identified as the most reliable site for external fluid delivery in draconian patients. The needle was designed for multiple species and it went in cleanly. Ned taped it down and set the drip rate low and steady. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. It was not perfect. A proper medical facility with proper equipment and a trained draconian specialist would have done it better. But Sale's breathing, when Ned counted it now, was marginally less shallow than it had been 10 minutes ago. The color at the edges of the wound was slightly less dark. Small changes. But small changes in the right direction were the only kind that mattered right now. He called it in. He pressed the comm unit on his wrist and reported to reach core base. 2 draconian juveniles, 1 critical injury, current location requesting medical backup and transport. The response came back in under a minute. A team was being assembled. Estimated arrival 40 minutes. Ned acknowledged and put his wrist down. Then he started talking again. To both of them. He told them the team was coming. He told Sale, who could not hear him, that he had done well by staying alive this long and that he just needed to keep doing it for a little while longer. He told Vorin, who was still standing 2 meters back watching everything, that his brother was stable for now and that help was on the way. He talked for the full 40 minutes. The team arrived in a low transport that set down 2 streets over. Dr. Prue Langston came through the shelter entrance first, kit over her shoulder, moving fast. She was the Reach Corps senior medic, a calm and sharp woman who had been doing field medicine longer than Ned had been alive and who almost never looked surprised by anything. She looked surprised now. She crouched beside Sale, ran her own diagnostic, checked Ned's work with quick careful eyes. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she looked up at Ned. "You stabilized a draconian chest compression injury with a field kit," she said. "He needed stabilizing," Ned said. She looked at him for another moment, then went back to work, reinforcing what Ned had done and preparing Sale for transport. The draconian officer came in shortly after. He was tall and gray-scaled, older, with the kind of face that had stopped showing much a long time ago. He was part of a relief unit doing a post-conflict sweep of the area. He looked at Sale. He looked at the fluid line, the packed wound, the jacket still folded across the small dragon's midsection. He pulled out a data pad, checked something and set it down. "Our field doctrine would have classified this casualty as non-recoverable," he said. His voice was flat and straightforward. He was not being cruel. He was simply stating a fact the way someone states the temperature outside. The injury profile and time elapsed would have indicated non-viable. Standard protocol would have been to log and move on. The shelter was quiet for a moment. Ned was wrapping a secondary line and did not look up right away. He finished the wrap, secured it, and then looked at the officer. He thought about what to say. Not because he was angry. Not because he wanted to argue doctrine or policy or the logic of military triage in a conflict zone. He understood all of that. He had read the protocols. He knew why they existed. He just also knew what he had found in this shelter. "He was still breathing," Ned said quietly. "That was enough for me." The officer looked at him for a long time. He did not answer. He picked up his datapad and walked back toward the entrance, and the shelter went quiet again except for the soft sound of Sale breathing, slow and thin but steady, still going, still there. Still enough. Nobody told Vorin to follow Ned. Nobody told him to stay close or to watch, or to spend his days moving quietly from one end of the Reach Corps camp to the other just to keep the human in sight. There was no order given, no agreement made, no moment where anyone sat down and decided this was how things were going to be. It just became how things were. The morning after Sale was moved to the medical unit, Ned walked out of his sleeping tent just before sunrise to do his equipment check and found Vorin sitting outside the tent entrance. Not blocking it. Not demanding anything. Just sitting there in the cold gray pre-dawn light with his wings folded and his tail wrapped around his feet, watching the camp the way a person watches something they are still deciding whether to trust. Ned looked at him for a moment. Then he said good morning, stepped around him and went to do his equipment check. Vorin got up and followed him. That was how it started. The Reach Corps camp was not a large place. It was a working camp, practical and temporary, set up in the ruins of a wide flat building that had mostly kept its roof. There were sleeping tents in 2 rows, a supply area covered with heavy canvas sheeting, a small medical unit in the most protected corner, a cooking station that ran on portable fuel cells and produced food that was technically nutritious and spiritually discouraging. About 30 people worked and lived in the camp. They were from 6 different planets and spoke 4 different languages between them and had the specific kind of easy tolerance that came from spending a long time in difficult places with people who were different from you. They accepted Vorin the way they accepted most unexpected things in the field, with a brief period of wide eyes, a few quiet conversations, and then a general decision to simply get on with it. Within 3 days, most of them had quietly started leaving a little extra food near whatever spot Vorin had settled into for the afternoon. Vorin noticed this. He did not respond to it with warmth exactly. But he stopped watching certain people with the same careful suspicion he had started with, and in the economy of a young dragon who had just lived through what he had lived through, that was considerable. He watched everything. That was the thing about him that everyone in the camp noticed first. He was not loud, not disruptive, did not break anything or cause problems. He was simply always watching. His pale eyes moved over everything with a slow, steady attention that missed nothing. He watched the medics work. He watched the engineers patch the damaged sections of the building. He watched the cook argue with the supply manifest every single morning over portions, which happened every day without variation and without either side ever winning. But mostly he watched Ned. He watched Ned do his morning equipment check, which Ned did the same way every day, left side of the kit first, then right, then the scanning tools, then a test of the fluid lines even when there was no obvious reason to test them. Ned was methodical in a way that Vorin found, over time, oddly reassuring. There was a pattern to it, a reliability. In a world that had recently shown Vorin exactly how quickly and completely things could fall apart, watching someone do the same careful thing the same careful way every single morning was something he had not known he needed until he found himself looking for it. He watched Ned treat patients. There was a steady flow of them through the camp, survivors from the surrounding area, injured from both sides of the recent conflict. A few cases that had nothing to do with the conflict at all and were simply the regular ongoing business of people existing in a hard place. Ned worked on all of them the same way. Focused, quiet, efficient. He talked to his patients while he worked, the same low steady voice he had used in the shelter. He explained what he was doing even when the patient could not understand him. He made sure they were warm. He checked on them afterward. One afternoon, a small alien child was brought in by a Reach Corps patrol. The child had been found alone near the southern grid, no family located, minor injuries but frightened badly. After Ned treated the injuries, he sat with the child for a while and eventually gave the child the food from his own afternoon ration, a wrapped portion he had been carrying in his jacket pocket. Vorin was watching from 12 feet away. He watched Ned give the food away without any visible consideration, the way you do something that is simply the obvious next thing to do. Then Ned stood up, checked on 2 other patients, and went back to his equipment without getting anything else to eat. Vorin watched the place where the food had been for a long time after that. He watched Ned in the evenings too. The camp quieted down after dark and most people gathered near the cooking station for a while before going to their tents. Ned usually sat a little apart from the main group, not unfriendly, just slightly separate, in the way of someone who needed a certain amount of quiet at the end of a day. He would sit on a piece of broken wall near the eastern edge of the camp and look out at nothing in particular, or write things in a small notebook or just be still. One night, about a week into it, Ned got word that 2 Reach Corps volunteers from another unit had not made it out of the southern grid. They had been doing the same kind of hazard sweep Ned had been doing when he found the brothers. A structural collapse. Fast and without warning. Ned got the message on his wrist unit while he was standing at the supply table. Vorin saw his face change. It did not fall apart, did not crumble. Ned was not someone who fell apart easily. But something in his expression went very still and very quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something important has just left it. That night Ned sat on his piece of broken wall for a long time. At some point he pressed the back of his hand against his eyes and stayed very still for a while. Vorin crossed the camp slowly and sat down nearby. Not right next to him. Not close enough to touch. Far enough to give him the space the posture asked for, close enough to make it clear that the space was not emptiness. He folded his wings in and sat with his tail around his feet and looked out at the same dark nothing Ned was looking at. He did not know human grief. He did not know what Ned was feeling or what the loss meant in the specific human way that losses meant things. But he knew what it looked like to carry something heavy. He knew what it looked like to sit with something at night because there was nowhere else to put it. He knew how to sit beside that instead of walking away from it. They stayed there for a long time without any words between them. Eventually Ned looked over at him. Not with surprise. Not with the slightly awkward gratitude that some of the other camp members showed when they interacted with Vorin. Just looked, the way you look at someone who showed up when you needed them to. He did not say anything. Neither did Vorin. After a while Ned went to his tent and Vorin settled in near the entrance the way he always did now, and the camp was quiet. It was a few days after that when Vorin approached Ned near the supply tent in the late afternoon. He moved with deliberate care, the way he did when he was doing something considered, something that mattered. He stopped in front of Ned and was still for a moment. Then, slowly, he raised his left wing slightly and used the clawed tip of his right hand to work a single scale loose from the leading edge. It was a dark scale, almost black, with a faint deep blue in the center that only showed in direct light. He held it out. Ned looked at it. He looked at Vorin. He did not know the exact meaning. He knew scales were significant in Draconian culture. The Reach Core cultural file had a section on it, though the details varied by clan. He could see from the way Vorin was holding it, the careful deliberate stillness of the offering, that this was not a casual gesture. It meant something deep and specific and real. And that was exactly why he could not take it. Not because he did not value it, but because he did not understand it fully enough to receive it properly, and something that clearly meant this much deserved to be understood before it was accepted. He reached out gently and closed Vorin's clawed hand back around the scale. Slowly, carefully, making sure the movement said no thank you and not I don't want this. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and found the strip of dried mango he had been saving since the last supply delivery. He held it out. Vorin looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it. He ate it slowly, with the focused consideration of someone experiencing something entirely new and trying to decide what to do with the information. Then he made a low sound in his throat that nobody in the camp could translate with any certainty, but that everyone who heard it agreed felt positive. Ned sat down on the ground. Vorin sat down beside him. The sun went low and orange over the broken walls of the ruined outpost, and the two of them sat together in the fading light without any particular need to fill the quiet with anything at all. The order came on a Tuesday morning. Ned was doing his equipment check when Dr. Prue Langston came out of the communications tent with a piece of paper in her hand and an expression on her face that he had learned, over time, meant that something uncomplicated had just become very complicated. She handed him the paper without saying anything first. He read it. Draconian Command had formally requested the return of both Vorin and Sale to military custody. The request used very clean official language, the kind of language that had been written carefully so that it did not sound like what it was. It referenced clan registration numbers. It cited Interspecies Custody Protocol, Section 4, Paragraph 9. It noted that the Reach Corps had no legal standing as a custodial body for registered Draconian individuals. It gave a deadline of 48 hours. At the very bottom, in smaller text, it said that non-compliance would be considered an obstruction of Draconian military administrative process. Ned read it twice. Then he folded it and handed it back. "When is the hearing?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," Prue said. "They're officers, 2 of our senior staff, and a neutral interspecies legal observer." She paused. "You're listed as a witness." Ned nodded and went back to his equipment check. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in his tent and looked at the ceiling and thought about the shelter. He thought about the drone screen and the words NO on priority and recommend bypass. He thought about sitting on a dusty floor and waiting. He thought about a strip of dried mango and a scale that had been offered with both hands and a young dragon sitting beside him in the dark without being asked to. He thought about Sale, who was walking now. Slowly, carefully, with a slight favor to his left side where the wound was still finishing its healing. But walking. Talking, in his own language, which Ned could not understand but which Vorin translated in gestures and expressions that Ned had gotten surprisingly good at reading. Sale had started watching Ned with the same quiet focused attention his brother had, and sometimes when Ned looked over he would find both brothers watching him at the same time, which was an experience that was hard to describe but that felt, in a way he could not fully explain, like being known. He did not want to lose that. He got up before sunrise and sat outside his tent in the cold and watched the sky get lighter. Vorin came and sat beside him, the way he always did in the early mornings now. Ned looked at him. He thought about trying to explain what was happening, what the hearing meant, what the outcome might be. He did not have the language for it and Vorin did not either. Not in any shared form. So he just sat with him in the gray pre-dawn quiet and let the morning come. The hearing was held in the largest interior space in the camp, a wide area near the center of the building that the Reach Corps used for briefings and supply organization. Someone had set up a long table with chairs on both sides. It looked more formal than anything else in the camp and slightly out of place because of it, like a piece of official furniture that had been dropped into the middle of a working life. 3 Draconian officers sat on one side. They were in full formal dress, which in Draconian military culture meant structured plate armor over the shoulders and chest, dark and polished. The senior officer was the same gray-scaled one who had come to the shelter 2 weeks ago, the one who had talked about doctrine and non-recoverable casualties. He sat in the center with his datapad in front of him and his expression set to the same flat professional neutral it had been set to the last time Ned saw him. Prue sat on the other side with the Reach Corps administrative officer, a quiet, careful man named Corporal Ben Ashford who handled the legal and logistical side of the Corps and who had spent the previous evening going through every interspecies welfare code he could access on the camp system. The neutral legal observer was a small gray-skinned being from a species Ned did not know well, seated at the end of the table with a recording device and no visible opinion about anything. Ned sat in a chair along the wall. Witness position. Not at the table. Voren and Sale were outside the building. They had been asked to wait. Voren had not been happy about this. Sale had put a hand on his brother's arm and said something quiet and Voren had gone still, and they had both gone to sit outside, though Ned had noticed that Voren chose a spot directly beside the wall closest to where the hearing was taking place. It started formally and stayed formal for about 15 minutes. The senior Draconian officer presented the command's position clearly and without visible emotion. Voren and Sale were registered members of Clan Dravash, identification numbers on record. Under interspecies law, registered clan members fell under the custodial authority of their clan and its military administration. The Reach Corps had provided emergency medical assistance, which was noted and not disputed, but emergency assistance did not create custodial rights. The brothers needed to be returned. The matter was straightforward. Ben Ashford responded with the welfare codes. He argued that the clan had made zero contact in 11 days. No retrieval team, no communication, no missing persons filing of any kind. He cited 3 different interspecies welfare statutes that addressed situations where registered individuals had received no contact or assistance from their registered custodial body within a defined period following a conflict event. He argued that the pattern of non-contact constituted effective abandonment under at least 2 of the 3 statutes. The senior officer said the clan's silence was a result of post-conflict administrative processing delays, not abandonment. He said the clan had been in active relocation. He said the proper channels for retrieval had simply not yet been completed. Ben asked how long those channels typically took. The officer said it varied. Ben asked if 11 days was within normal variation. The officer said that was not the relevant question. Prue leaned forward and said she believed it was exactly the relevant question. The room went back and forth for a while. Legal language and counter-language, statute numbers, definitions of terms, the careful technical conversation of people who were trying to win something using words instead of anything else. It was important work and Ned respected it. Ben was good at it. Prue was steady and clear. But the room was moving in circles and he could feel it. He looked at the senior officer. The officer was responding to Ben's latest point with a measured counter-argument about administrative process. His face was composed and professional and entirely certain. He was not a bad person, Ned thought. He genuinely was not. He was a person operating inside a system that had clear rules and following those rules the way he had been trained to follow them for his entire career. The problem was that the rules had been written for situations, not for individuals. And what was sitting outside the wall of this building right now was not a situation. Ned stood up. He was not on the agenda. He was not supposed to speak. Prue looked at him quickly, a sharp look that asked a clear question. He met her eyes. She held his gaze for a moment and then she did not sit him down. The room went quiet. The senior officer looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite annoyance but somewhere in the middle. Ned did not introduce himself. Everyone in the room knew who he was. He spoke quietly and he spoke simply and he told the room exactly what had happened from the beginning. He described the drone reading and the words recommend bypass. He described going in on foot. He described the shelter, the dark, the smell, the sound of the hiss from the far end of the room. He described sitting on the floor and putting his hands flat and waiting. He described the wound and the temperature and the anatomy file he had downloaded on a quiet night 14 months ago because he believed knowing things was never wasted. He described folding his jacket and laying it over a small dragon who was cold and running out of time. He did not dramatize any of it. He just said what had happened the way it had happened. Then he stopped. He looked at the senior officer directly, and when he spoke again his voice was very quiet. If I had not gone in, Ned said, and those 2 had died in that shelter, would anyone in this room have filed a report? The room was completely still. The legal observer's recording device made a small sound. Someone shifted in a chair. Outside, very faintly, the wind moved through the ruins. The senior officer looked at Ned. His expression had not changed, not exactly, but something behind it had shifted very slightly, the way weight shifts when something is placed on a scale. He did not answer. He looked down at his datapad. He looked at the table. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment. And the silence stretched out and said everything that nobody in that room was willing to say out loud. Ned sat back down. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at the floor and waited for the room to decide what kind of place it wanted to be. The hearing did not end with a decision that day. The senior Draconian officer called a recess after Ned's question, and the room emptied out in the careful, quiet way rooms empty when something has been said that everyone needs time to sit with. Prue touched Ned's arm briefly as she walked past him and said nothing, which from her meant more than most people's words. Ben Ashford gathered his papers with the focused calm of someone who had done everything he could and was now waiting to find out if it had been enough. Ned walked outside. Voren was exactly where he had expected him to be, pressed against the outer wall of the building with his ear to the stone. He straightened when Ned came out, and his eyes asked the question his mouth could not form in any language Ned understood. Ned shook his head slowly. Not yet. Voren looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down against the wall and Ned sat down beside him, and Sale, who had been resting a few feet away, moved closer until the three of them were sitting in a line against the sun-warmed stone, saying nothing, waiting together the way they had all gotten used to waiting together by now. The answer came the next morning. Not through Prue. Not through Ben Ashford or the Legal Observer or any of the official channels the hearing had been built around. It came through a message delivered directly to the Reach Corps administrative system from the senior Draconian officer's personal command unit, filed at some point in the early hours of the morning when most of the camp was still asleep. Prue read it first. Then she came to find Ned. She handed him her datapad without saying anything, the same way she had handed him the original order 2 days ago. He had a brief moment of thinking that she had a talent for delivering important information in complete silence, and then he started reading. The message was not long. The senior officer had filed a formal recommendation citing an old provision in Draconian legal code. He had attached the full text of the provision, which was called the Voluntary Companionship Accord. Ned read through it carefully. The language was old, formal, and dense in places, but the meaning was clear enough. The accord had been written generations ago for situations where Draconian individuals had become separated from their clan through conflict or disaster and had formed a significant bond with a non-Draconian being during that separation. It allowed the non-Draconian to be formally recognized as what the accord called an anchor. Not an owner. Not a legal guardian in the standard sense. Something older than that and less easy to categorize. Someone the clanless individual was bound to by choice and circumstance, recognized by law as a stable point in a destabilized life. The officer had included a note at the bottom of the message. It was 3 sentences. He wrote that Voren and Sale had received no contact from Clan Dravash in 12 days and were being formally reclassified as clanless pending further administrative review. He wrote that the Voluntary Companionship Accord was rarely used and that its application in an interspecies context was without clear precedent. He wrote that in his assessment the situation before the board was also without clear precedent, and that perhaps that was the point. That was all. Ned read the note twice. Then he looked up at Prue. She was watching him with the expression she wore when she already knew what someone was going to do and was simply waiting for them to do it. "Where do I sign?" Ned said. It was not a question. Prue almost smiled. She tapped the bottom of the datapad screen where a signature line was waiting. Ned signed it. He signed it the way he had gone into the shelter, without calculating the cost, without running through the complications, without asking himself whether it was the practical thing or the advised thing or the thing that made the most sense on paper. He signed it because there were 2 young dragons on the other side of the camp wall who had been left in the dark by everyone who was supposed to come back for them, and he had walked in instead, and that meant something. It had always meant something. Just had a legal name now. He went to find the brothers. Voren knew before Ned reached him. Ned did not know how, whether it was something in his posture or his pace or simply that Voren had spent enough weeks studying every small detail of this particular human that he could read things before they were said. The young dragon went very still when Ned came around the corner of the building, and his eyes moved over Ned's face with rapid, careful attention. Ned stopped in front of him. He nodded once. Voren was still for another moment. Then he turned to Sale, who was sitting nearby, and said something in Draconian. His voice was low and even, but there was something in it that was not his usual careful composure, something that moved underneath the steadiness like water under ice. Sale listened. Then he looked at Ned. His pale silver scales had come back to something closer to their proper color over the past weeks. The wound on his chest was healing cleanly, a long ridge of new scale growth already showing at the edges. He was not fully recovered yet and he moved with care, but the fragility of those first days in the shelter was gone. He looked at Ned with eyes that were clear and focused and full of something that did not need a translation. He said Ned's name. He had been practicing it for several days, working through the human vowel sounds with the focused determination he applied to everything he did not yet understand. He got it right more often than not now. Ned said his name back. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. 3 days later, they boarded a Reach Corps transport heading to a new assignment on the outer medical circuit. It was a mid-sized vessel, practical and slightly worn the way all Reach Corps equipment was practical and slightly worn, with wide low seating and large observation windows along both sides. It smelled like recycled air and old metal and the particular kind of institutional cleanliness that came from surfaces being wiped down so many times that the cleaning itself had become part of the smell. Vorin took the seat nearest the window without being directed to it, the way he always oriented himself toward the outside edge of any space he was in. Old instinct probably. He sat with his tail wrapped around the chair leg and watched the ruined outpost get smaller below them as the transport lifted and turned and headed out. He watched until the ruins disappeared into the clouds. Then he looked forward and did not look back. Sale sat beside Ned. He had been working on something for the past 2 days, practicing quietly in the evenings near the cooking station while Ned wrote in his notebook. He had asked Ned, through gestures and a considerable amount of patience on both sides, to teach him a human word. A useful one. A small one. Ned had thought about it and taught him the word okay and had explained as best he could what it meant. That things were alright, that nothing was broken, that you were here and you were fine and the moment you were in was a survivable one. Sale had been working on it ever since. He tried it now, sitting in the transport seat as the clouds moved past the window. He got the first part right and then his mouth did something complicated with the second syllable that turned it into something that was not quite the word but was in the general neighborhood of it. He tried again. Still not quite right. He made a sound of frustration that was very recognizable across species lines and tried a third time. Ned listened and then said it back to him slowly, breaking it into its 2 small parts, stretching each one out. Sale repeated it. Closer this time. Then he tried the whole thing fast and it came out slightly sideways and he stopped and stared at the seat in front of him as if the word had personally offended him. Vorin, from across the aisle, watched his brother's expression. Then he made a sound that was absolutely and unmistakably laughter. Not loud, not long, but real, warm and genuine and slightly at Sale's expense in the way that only a brother's laugh could be. Sale turned and looked at Vorin with an expression of profound betrayal. Ned started laughing too. He could not help it. Sale looked at both of them. Then something in his face broke open and he laughed as well, a deep rumbling sound that filled the transport cabin and made the other passengers look over with expressions ranging from startled to quietly charmed. Vorin's laughter faded into something softer. He looked at his brother laughing, really laughing, in the bright interior light of a transport heading somewhere new, and his face did the thing it had done sometimes in the past weeks. It went quiet and still and gentle in a way that his face had not been capable of back in that cold dark shelter. Ned looked at them both for a moment. Then he turned to the observation window. The clouds had cleared. The sky had gone from pale morning blue to the deep dark at the edge of atmosphere, and the stars were beginning to show, scattered and cold and impossibly far away in every direction. They looked the way they always looked from a rising transport, like a reminder of how large everything was and how small any one point inside it was. He thought about small things. About a scanner drone and 2 words on a small screen. About a dusty floor and 2 flat palms and the particular act of sitting down instead of standing up. About a wound that doctrine had called non-recoverable and a quiet night 14 months ago when he had downloaded a file he was not sure he would ever need. About a jacket folded over a small cold body. About dried mango and a scale held in careful clawed hands. About a question asked in a quiet room and the silence that had answered it. He thought about the kind of person who went back. The universe was very old and very large and very full of systems and doctrines and protocols that had been built by intelligent beings over long careful years to manage the impossible complexity of existing alongside each other. Most of those systems were necessary. Most of them were built with real thought and real purpose. He understood that. But systems were built for situations. And sometimes what you found when you walked into the wreckage was not a situation. Sometimes it was just 2 people who had been left behind. Humans were not the strongest species in the known galaxy. They were not the oldest or the most technologically advanced or the most feared. There were civilizations out there that had been crossing the space between stars since before humans had learned to write anything down. There were beings with longer lives, harder bodies, sharper minds, deeper histories. But there was something that humans did that was harder to put in a file or a doctrine or a legal provision. Something that did not show up cleanly in any assessment or any scan. When the universe turned away, humans turned back. Not always. Not every time. Not perfectly. There were humans who walked past the shelter too, who looked at the screen and accepted the words recommend bypass and kept moving, because they were tired or afraid or simply had not yet decided what kind of person they were going to be. But enough of them turned back. Enough of them sat down on dusty floors and waited to be trusted. Enough of them folded their jackets and gave away their food and stood up in quiet rooms and asked the question that nobody wanted to answer. Enough of them walked in. Behind him, Sale tried the word one more time. This time he got it exactly right. Ned heard it and smiled at the window and said nothing because some moments were better left exactly as they were, small and warm and just enough. The transport moved out through the dark between stars, carrying a field medic and 2 dragon brothers and something that had no single name in any language any of them spoke, but that all 3 of them already knew, in the quiet certain way you know the things that matter most, that they were never going to let go of.